one of the most influential Christian leaders in history, credited with bringing the church outside of the Middle East and into the key Roman provinces throughout Europe, was a man named Saul of Tarsus. You probably know him by his Roman name, Paul. Paul was the premier missionary in the New Testament, and the better part of the New Testament is actually made up of letters written by him. However, before Paul was this larger-than-life apostle or prolific writer, he was a well-educated cosmopolitan man of two cultures, hence his two names. He was trained in Jewish history and theology as well as Greco-Roman culture, language, rhetoric, and the arts. As a result of his studies, some of his ambition, and maybe even using some of his parents' influence, Paul became a leader. He himself wrote about this when he wrote a letter to the Galatians. He said, "I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors." He was a good student. He had a lot of drive. That zeal led him down a path that would be shocking to most of us today. The first time we meet Paul in the New Testament, he is giving approval to Stephen's death. That day, the Bible tells us, there was a severe persecution that began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered. And they were scattered throughout the countryside of Judea, all the way to Samaria, and sometimes even beyond. And Paul would enter homes and drag out Christians, throwing them in prison and sentencing many of them to death, as he had done Stephen. I want you to think about that. The one who is credited with having the most influential impact on Christianity, aside from Jesus, of course, got his start by hunting down Christians. Yet remember, Paul was a faithful person. He was incredibly zealous in his faith, so a lot of us would ask, how could he do this? Well, it was because of that passion, because of that zeal. His knowledge and passion and devotion to his faith were rooted in the way he had been taught about his faith. That is, his persecution of Christianity was an attempt to defend his own faith against a threatening new ideology, one that struck at the story of his own ancestors, which is pretty relatable, right? When information or ideas or arguments contradict anything that we hold to be true, we become pretty defensive, maybe even aggressive, right? You see this on social media. At that point, fight or flight kicks in. For me, this moment came my first semester of college. I was a religion major in my first biblical studies course, and each day of class, my professor would teach about the Bible, but not the way that I had learned. He would teach about its sources, its origins, and its authorship. Now, to my mind, this was insanity. After all, the only source, origin, and author of the Bible was God, thank you very much. And yet, here I was sitting in this class, hearing about all this history and process of how the Bible came to exist. But I was not caught unawares. This was the moment I had been trained for, to rebuke heretics and to stay true to my faith, not letting them steal my Jesus. And so I refused to allow these lies to enter into my mind. And I put my professor on my church's prayer list because he was leading students astray. He might deceive others, but this man would not steal my Jesus, as I had been warned so many professors would do. So I learned what I had to for tests, but I wasn't letting this man's heresy into my heart. But here is the problem with all this. My professor was right. What he was saying was founded on centuries of research done by reputable scholars. And this realization led to a paradigm shift for me. Or to put it more honestly, it led to a bit of a breakdown. Everything that I'd ever believed about the Bible was being debunked. Paul had a similar breakdown of his own. As the story goes, Paul's persecution tour was cut short. While he was on his way to a place called Damascus, he was stopped by a blinding light. And in his own words, Paul says, "I was traveling to Damascus with the authority and the commission of the chief priests, when at midday along the road I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining around me and my companions. When we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It hurts you to kick against the goads." I asked, "Who are you, Lord?" And the Lord answered, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Paul had trained for the better part of his life up to this point to defend the faith and fight against anything that might threaten it. Paul was on a crusade to protect God from the world's influence. And while he was out there, supposedly doing God's work, he ended up meeting the very God he was trying to protect. Paul was left dumbfounded and blinded from the meeting. He was escorted to Damascus, where he prayed for 3 days before God sent a rightly terrified Christian named Ananias to tend to Paul. When Ananias arrived, he prayed for Paul. And we're told that something like scales fell from his eyes, and his sight was restored. Paul, seeing Jesus, identifying God as the one he was hunting down and murdering, led to a breakdown for Paul. This phenomenon is a form of what we call cognitive dissonance. That's when someone tries to balance inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes with new information. For a lot of people, this leads to a sort of breakdown, like the one that I had my freshman year when my faith was at odds with all these new teachings. Toward the end of my freshman year, I met with an advisor who knew I was having a really difficult time. I explained everything. How I was concerned for my professors and for other students, for theology. I also expressed concern for my own faith. What happened next was my own Ananias moment. "Wade," my advisor said, "never forget that Jesus is the way and the truth and the life. And if you're fighting against something that's true, even if it's different from what you've always thought, you might find you're fighting against Jesus." You know, at that moment, something like scales fell off of my eyes, like Paul. I could see clearly. And those words didn't just change my freshman year, but they changed my whole life. We all, like Paul, have a tendency to want to protect God, defending God from being tainted by the world. But hear this, God does not need our defending. In fact, usually our fight for God is just a fight to preserve our limited perspective of God, which often ends up as a fight against God. And we end up bloodying a lot of people along the way. So what if, instead of trying to preserve our first impressions of God, we opened ourselves up to a bigger understanding of God? What if instead of fighting to protect our Jesus so he won't be stolen away, we allowed ourselves to learn and to grow and to examine and even test our perspectives? And what if, as we struggle through this, we realize that the scales that have limited our sight of God up to this point begin to fall, and we start to see clearly the one who is the way, the truth, and the life.